Today we're going to be looking at Lunar Tides in the color Plum. So first thing you may notice is that my swatches are labeled 1 through 12. I do quickly just want to say that is not synonymous with hair levels. I do different video clips and pictures throughout the video, so numbers just help us keep track of each swatch. Also, these are not virgin hair, which means they've been chemically colored, treated, or bleached at some point in their existences. 1 is green, 2 is a cool tone gray, 3 is a darker natural red, 4 is black, 4 to 11 is a range that goes to platinum blonde, and then 12 is like a toned version of number 11. So to start, I'll be taking the color directly from the container and I will apply it to the very top of each swatch. Then some people do like to dilute their dyes, so I will do a diluted version at the bottom of each swatch. Please keep in mind everyone's hair is different, which means everyone's hair will take color differently, plus different screens and monitors can make colors look different, so please just use my video as a reference for how this could possibly turn out for you. For the diluted section, we're going to do a 4:1 ratio. So that's going to be 1 part of the dye to 4 parts diluter. If you're unsure what diluter is, my simple way of putting it is that it's basically something that lightens the color of a semi-permanent dye. Now, each brand usually will sell their own version of a diluter, which will keep the same consistency as your dye. But because I use so many different brands, I actually just use a plain white conditioner as my diluter. I'm going to let this sit for about 3 hours just so the color can fully absorb into the swatches. I will then rinse it out, and when they're dry, I will meet you back here and we can do some comparisons. So this is editing Floxy popping in really quick just to apologize for how the swatches look in this section of the video. So this part of the video is filmed in my natural house lighting, and while this color does look darker in natural house lighting, for some reason it looks incredibly dark on camera, and that's not quite how it looks in person. So if you're here just to see what it looks like after it's dyed, feel free to skip ahead in the video. I do a before and after section as well as a picture of all the swatches together. Those are done in natural lighting and are way more accurate to how the swatches actually turned out. Again, I'm sorry, but hopefully this part of the video is at least helpful for anyone who wants to hear about how each swatch took the color and for anyone who wants to see comparisons. Okay, so quickly, I do just want to remind everyone that my swatches are not virgin hair. Virgin hair tends to be less porous, which means it usually has a harder time taking color, and if it does take color, it can fade really quickly. Now, part of why I say that is because I do actually see a difference on a majority of the swatches. So if you have virgin hair, especially if it's darker, how it turns out for you could be different, and I definitely suggest a strand test. That being said though, because I do see a difference on a majority of the swatches, that does mean that this color is most likely pretty pigmented. So if you were to try a color over virgin hair, this could be one that I think would be more likely to give you a better result versus something like a pastel would. So one was originally green. On the direct eye portion, I do not see any green coming through. Now, if I look at that compared to the more blonde swatches, the purple turned out a lot more ashy and muted and even more cool toned than it did on the blonder swatches. And that stayed pretty consistent onto the diluted section as well. But I do see a tiny bit of the green coming through still, so I wouldn't dilute it as much as I did if you are trying to cover a green. 2 was gray. Once again, comparing that to the blonde swatch, it definitely looks a little bit more cool toned, which, makes sense considering gray tends to be quite cool. And it covered pretty consistently on both the top and the diluted section. 3 was the natural red. Sometimes the 3 will turn out like the darker swatches. And if I'm looking at the direct eye portion, I would say that. So I'm going to lump it in with like number 7. Maybe between 6 and 7, because it's not as dark as 6, but it looks a little bit darker than 7 turned out. So you can see a slight purple hue. It definitely darkened the swatch as well. I won't go as far to say that it looks black, but again, it is very dark. On the diluted section, I think the warm undertone did play a little bit more of a role in the natural red swatch, because it does lean a little bit more warm than it does on 6 and 7. But it definitely doesn't look like a natural red anymore. There's a definite purple hue that wasn't there before. Number 4 was black. I don't see a difference on that one. Number 5, I'm kind of struggling to tell if I see a difference on that one. I think, if anything, it looks darker, but at least in this lighting that I'm currently in, it just looks like a dark brown. But there must be some difference because the top does look darker than the bottom. Now, as for the direct eye for number 6, that one turned out even darker, like compared to number 3, and I was saying how that one turned out quite dark. The number 6 turned out even darker, likely because the swatch was darker. I do see a slight purple hue, but it is sort of hard to see. Again, I wouldn't go as far to say that it looks black, but it does look very, very, very deep. The diluted section, on the other hand, almost looks like the brown that it was before, just with a nice purple hue to it. It might be a little darker than it was before. It's a little hard to tell. Then with number 7, like I said, pretty much the same idea as number 3. It does look a little bit lighter, so I do see a tiny bit more purple coming through on the direct eye portion. And then for the diluted section, it does look a little less warm than the number 3, so I do see a little bit more purple. Similarly to number 6, it is kind of like a purpley brown, but more purple than number 6 turned out. I would say number 8 is pretty similar. As the swatches get lighter, you see more and more purple coming through. So the direct dye portion and the diluted section just have a touch more purple than number 7 did, but you still see a little bit of that brown coming through, just a little tiny bit. So as you could imagine, that pattern continues all the way up until you get to the number 11 swatch. So the number 11 swatch, both the direct dye and the diluted section look quite purple. I would say number 10 also does look quite purple on both the top and the bottom. It just looks a little bit less saturated, assuming that's from the natural colors underneath. Same thing with number 9, looks slightly less purple than 10, so it looks even less purple than 11, of course. But I still definitely see the purple hue coming through, just has a little bit more of a natural look in comparison to the number 11. And then 12 was the toned swatch. I would say the biggest difference I see with that one is that it just seems to be a little bit darker. Now, sometimes with purple dye, toning can be a good idea because purple and yellow will sometimes neutralize each other out. So as for comparisons, I have 2, as usual. One is slightly more cool in undertone and the other is slightly more warm. So let's start with the slightly more cool undertone. That's going to be Arctic Fox in the color Purple AF. This is comparable to number 12, 11, 10, and comparable to number 9. Hopefully my camera can pick up on the slight difference. Now it's really not a major difference at all, but if you look closely, the Purple AF does just lean slightly more cool. So there's just like a touch of blue in there that the Lunar Tides Plum doesn't have. But honestly, I feel like it's more noticeable on the direct eye portion. Oftentimes the diluted section will be quite different as well, but the undertones actually don't seem to be wildly different when you start diluting it. It's still different. Otherwise, I would say they both are about the same depth. just about as dark as each other. And I know Purple AF is also quite pigmented, so really it's just preference. Now, I don't remember how much I did dilute the Purple AF. I did the video a while ago, but you can see on like the 10 and the 9 just how light it is on the diluted section for Purple AF. So you might have a slightly better result with the Lunar Tides Plum if you are looking to dilute it over not perfectly platinum blonde hair. But again, I would do strand tests just in case. The other comparison I wanted to do, again, is the slightly more warm undertone, and that's going to be Manic Panic in the color Purple Haze. This is comparable to number 12, 11, 10, and 9. So once again, they're about the same depth, I would say, which is kind of nice having that variety for undertones, but not having to compromise too much on how dark a color is. Again, not totally sure if my camera will pick up on the differences on the direct eye portion, but this time you can definitely see the difference on the diluted sections at least. And from what I remember using Purple Haze, it is also pretty pigmented as well. I'm seeing slightly more color on the Lunar Tides swatch for 9 and 10, so it might be a little bit better for slightly darker hair. But I think that's partially because the Purple Haze seems to be on its own just a little bit more muted, whereas the Lunar Tides does seem to be slightly more saturated, because that definitely could play a role. Either way, if we're just talking undertone, Lunar Tides Plum is perfectly in between the Purple AF, which leans more cool, and the Manic Panic Purple Haze, which leans more warm. It's right in between. All right, so now I would like to do our before and after clips. Those, as well as anything past this point in the video, will all be done in natural lighting. Because I am using natural lighting, that does mean the lighting environment outside can change between days. So if my before and after clips look kind of off or different from each other, that is why.
Welcome to another day in the life of
I hope my video helped. If you have a request, I do have a link below to a Google form you can fill out. Just remember, I only do brands that do not test on animals. If you decide to use my code FLOXY to get 15% off your order, thank you for that as well. Thank you to my patrons and thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video.